Hello everyone, and thank you again for joining to another edition of Through Conversations podcast, the platform for the most brilliant minds. In this episode, I'm joined by Angela Saini. Angela Saini is an award-winning British science journalist and broadcaster. She presents science programs on the BBC, and her writing has appeared in New Scientist, The Sunday Times, National Geographic, and Wired. Her latest book, Superior, The Return of Race Science, was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize and named Book of the Year by the Telegraph, Nature, and Financial Times. Her previous book, Inferior, How Science Got Women Wrong, has been translated into 13 languages. Angela has a master's in engineering from the University of Oxford and was a fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In this conversation, we talked about her newest book, Superior, The Return of Race Science, and many ideas that surround her book, including the nature versus nurture debate. How should we define progress, genetics, creeping ideologies in science, and much more. Hi, Angela. I really thank you for being here in this edition of Through Conversations podcast. After reading your book, I was mind blown, and it was an eye opener, honestly. And you begin with an amazing quote, and I would like you to expand on it. You begin by saying that this book is for your parents, the only ancestors you need to know. Why?
It's a bit tongue-in-cheek because obviously I do have grandparents, or at least I did have grandparents who have all passed away, sadly. I do have extended family, but I think one of the core themes in Superior is the question of origin and belonging. And I think, we have, as individuals, many layers of belonging. We have our immediate families, we have our extended families, we have the nation that we live in, and sometimes also we have an attachment to our race or our ethnicity. And when I finished writing Superior, although I completely understand and I also share in the feeling of patriotism, if you want to call it that, or an attachment to the nation that you live in, and also to some extent an attachment to your cultural background, whatever that might be, if it's different from the nation that you live in, or your cultural history or ancestral history. Ultimately, I think we are really, in the end, only a product of our experiences, our personal experiences. Everything else lives in our imagination. It's our experiences that really shape who we are and how we think about things. And as the child of immigrants, so I didn't grow up around my extended family. I grew up with my parents only, as my immediate family. For me, they were everything. They shaped who I am, my ideas about the world. They are where I draw much of my culture from. I also get it from the society I live in, but in those formative years, they were the only ancestors I really needed to know. And so I wrote that at the beginning, that dedication, really kind of puncturing this idea that there is a lot beyond that. I don't think there is much beyond that, if I'm honest.
I think just with this beginning statement, there's just all of these topics that you mentioned are broadly covered in your book Superior. It makes my mind just runs around the question of how are genetics involved with us being the product of our experiences, and how do we understand the relationship between us growing as individuals and us growing in a certain society. We've all tried to understand that ourselves are only rooted in our genetics, in our biology, and then we unfold as our experiences dictate. But for you, if I'm getting on correctly, it's the other way around. It should be first experiences and then some genes unfold.
I think it's a combination of both. One of the mistakes I think we have made, and one of the reasons that we make this mistake, is that Sir Francis Galton, who was the scientist, he was a cousin of Darwin, and he came up with eugenics, this kind of pseudoscientific theory that a population can be improved if you encourage certain people to breed and other people not to breed. So
Yeah.
he coined this phrase, nature versus nurture. And we still live with that now. We still talk about it quite regularly in academic circles, in mainstream life. We think of these two kind of dichotomous things that are almost separate to each other, nature and nurture. And one of the aims of biology, human biology, is to get to the root of nature by somehow eliminating the effects of nurture. And the point I wanted to make in Superior, that I also tried to make in my previous book, Inferior, which was on women, is that these two things are not separate. They're completely intertwined. They affect each other profoundly. In ways that we're only just starting to get a handle on. So, for example, one of the recent discoveries in neuroscience is when we compare the brains of humans to other primates. One of the biggest differences we don't see that many differences, but one of the big differences we see is plasticity. So human brains are incredibly plastic even into adulthood.
Wow.
Which other primates do not show that degree of change. And I think it's possible, or at least this is a theory, that degree of plasticity explains so much of the human variety that we see around us in terms of culture and society. So culture and environment is shaping us, not just kind of as a layer sitting on top of biology, but it's actually shaping our brains. Our brains themselves are being molded and manipulated by the cultures that we're in. Bonds are being formed in certain ways, connections are being formed in certain ways because of the environment that we're in. And that goes not just for our brains, but also for our bodies, how we choose to live, whether we live sedentary lifestyles or active lifestyle. All of these things have a profound impact on who we are. And all of these things are shaped by culture and the environment. So I think it's a mistake to think of genes and biology is somehow being separate from everything else. They are all intertwined, not to mention these ideas, which I don't go into because it's a very nascent field, but epigenetics. So this new field that is kind of treading into the territory of trying to explain whether effects can last into generations, genetic effects can last into generations, whether genetic changes happen within your lifetime. I think it's too early to speculate on the nature of those changes, but what we do know is that we are not static creatures. We are always changing, and if there's one thing that makes humans different from other species, I would say it's our ability to change, our adaptability, our variability, and this is why it's so difficult to get to the heart of the puzzle of human nature. What is human nature? It really depends on who you're studying and what time you're studying them in. It varies so much. People on this planet live in so many different ways. There are some societies that are very egalitarian. There are some societies that are very patriarchal or hierarchical. There are some societies in which diets are completely different, habits are completely different. There are so many different ways of living, and that's not because we humans come in different forms. It's because we are able to adapt and create cultures in so many different varieties.
So we've all tried to measure progress in humanity, right? And one of the big slippery slopes has been genetics, trying to measure it by trying to enhance breeding with the best and the survival of the fittest and Darwin and all of that. But I think we can both agree that we all want the best for humanity. That's the biggest thing. And what's counterintuitive of eugenics is that we thought that the best have to breed, and it's quoting Galton, and I'm not saying this. The Aryans have to breed with Aryans to produce the best, or for the Jews, Ashkenazi Jews have to breed with themselves to become better, or with India, they can reproduce with themselves only. So it is rather counterintuitive, right? The idea of breeding ourselves to perfection, that we can be, if we diversify ourselves a lot, it strengthens ourselves. And we can see that happening in nature as well with bananas. There's reports that one virus can kill the whole plant's bananas, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so there's loads of different threads there, but I think what it comes down to is genetics. How do we frame our ideas about what our genes do for us and how we can possibly improve them? Now, the idea of progression, that the human race is, or the human species is somehow improving over
Mm-hmm.
time, is a construction in itself. We are not improving. All we are is adapted to the environment that we live in. We're particularly well adapted because we are one of those few species that change our environment to suit us rather than us changing to suit the environment. So, that's our big skill. That's what allows us to live wherever we want on the planet, pretty much. And so, this idea that you can somehow enhance or improve people is a total misnomer. We are suited already to the environment that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever genetic changes or evolutionary changes happen to us now will only be there to adapt us further. They won't be there. Whatever ideas we have or values that we have about improvement really are a product of the society that we live in, what we value. Now, here in the UK where I live, or in Europe, one of the big values is intelligence. This was the aim, that we can breed for beauty and intelligence in particular. And one of the big things that eugenicists in the UK did in the early 20th century was they went out and they invented IQ tests, they invented intelligence testing in order to get to the heart of who are the smart people, who are not the smart people, in the assumption that this smartness would travel through generations.
Yes.
Now, there is a genetic component to intelligence, as we call it. We can't capture all of what we think of as intelligence because it's such a huge, broad, difficult to pin down kind of idea. But in as much as in some countries we test it in a certain way, we can correlate that with certain genetic qualities or certain gene variants, and then we can draw inferences from that about some people having these more than others, and then this being heritable. Now, even the most optimistic estimates put the heritability of intelligence at about 50%. And that is only if you are raised in an environment where you have all your needs taken care of, where you have all the nutrition and the food that you need, where you have stimulation, intellectual stimulation, where a child has everything they need. Bear in mind that most children on the planet do not have those things, number one. For children of the lowest socioeconomic groups, heritability of intelligence can fall to as low as 0. So the genes really make no difference at that point. It's all everything else that's making a difference in their lives at that point. So I think when we talk about improvement and genetics and all of these things, what we're doing is assuming that genes are somehow some kind of blueprint that define, in a fatalistic way, define everything that you're ever going to be. And that's just not true. It's not true. In fact, the world wouldn't look the way it did if that was the case. We know that richer kids do better in life. This isn't because they have better genes. It's because they have all the opportunities and all the inputs that they need to become those great people. And when we resort to genetics as an explanation for why some people do better than others, what we're really doing is being fatalistic. What we're saying is that there's nothing we can do for everybody else, that there is something in that child that at the moment they're born will determine who they become. And I just don't buy that. One, because the science doesn't back it up, and two, because our experience doesn't back it up.
You put it perfectly right now, and in your book you say that if you plant 2 seeds in different bases, one with great rich soil and the other with dry soil, both will come out very differently, evidently. And I can see your point. It's a slippery slope when we do that, because, as you say, if progress is a construct, then we're doing it ourselves and we don't have a guideline. So everyone has their own definition of progress. And what's happening with genetics is that how should we define progress? Because it clearly creates an effect on the policies we make, on how we treat others, and how we define other people. And the other thing that you put perfectly is when you interview Kaufman in your book, that you say that the biggest risk of it is that we try to use genetics to hide ourselves and just justify that some people are poor because they were born prone to be poor, rather than saying we can create change in their lives by educating them better. No? So
yeah, and there are still researchers out there who are looking at the genetics of poor people and rich people, for instance, people in poorer areas and wealthier areas, and trying to draw some kind of conclusions about why poor people are poor and why rich people are rich, which are just, I find bizarre. It's like 100, it's so old fashioned as a way of doing research, or even as a question to be asking, because it really takes us back to that old eugenic argument that certain people live the way they do, not because of all the different other circumstances that might be there in their lives, but because there's something deep down inside. There's some kind of kernel that makes them more feckless or more lazy or less smart or more criminally prone. We need to move away from that. And also we need to ask ourselves, when we talk about perfection, what do we actually mean and what do we actually want?
yes.
You know, what do I think of as perfection is not necessarily what the next person does. And what we as a society value, I think, we have to be very careful about what we assume would be the best possible traits in our kids. For me, even more than intelligence or even more than beauty or height or, you know, whatever other trait someone would want to select in their embryo, I would want that person to be good natured, you know, kind. Why do I never hear geneticists or eugenicists talking about those qualities?
It's very interesting.
Why do we never as a society value kind of generosity or modesty or these other virtues? We are looking for things that make us more productive, that kind of lift us up in the hierarchy. That is a game. That is all a game, I think, and it's not necessarily the qualities we actually want in people to build a better society.
Yes. The big theme is that we've associated progress with industrialization and as you say, production, which is evident that we measure things by GDP and output. And what's counterintuitive about that is that more people tend to suicide in developed countries than in developing countries. So the happiness measurement is something it's interesting to see, because there is a disconnect between what we think of what's progress and what actually is, and that's a very philosophical conversation, because we are all in this game together trying to make the best out of life. So, and the definitions of progress can vary.
I think this gets to the heart of what we need to resolve in the future. I think we've got to a point where capitalist democracy has for so long presented this kind of promise that actually hasn't worked for most people. Inequality is rising. So many people have mental health issues, depression, like you say, rates of suicide, especially among young men in this country, are huge. Yeah. They're so high. People are unhappy. We know that the system isn't working, and yet we don't have any alternatives. We haven't really thought about anything else. I mean, for a long time, all we had was communism and capitalism. We have to be able to think beyond both of those options and just ask, actually, what society do we want to create in order to live happier, healthier lives? I don't know what we'll come up with. I really don't. But I don't think the answer lies, for example, in old-fashioned pseudoscientific ideologies like eugenics. I don't think it lies in transhumanism or anything like that. I think it lies in coming up with systems that work for everyone rather than hierarchies which traditionally have served only the elites. We have to think about ways that work for everybody.
Yes. And we're getting into a very, very difficult conversation, because often we've associated economic systems with ideologies, right? So either you're red or you're capitalist, you know, and there's division, and that's a big theme also in Superior, in the way you offer this new perspective about how we should think of the genetics and the future it holds, that ideologies are very embedded in the way we're doing research. And that's a thing that when I read it, it kind of broke my heart, because at the end of the day, I'm a 21-year-old, right? And I don't want to live in a world where all of my scientific journals and everything that I read has to come up with some sort of agenda to serve, right? So how do you think we can prevent, publicizing ideologies, but keep also an open mind, and at the same time offer truth and not just an agenda?
It's difficult. I think truth is more possible in certain fields than others. I think when we're talking about human biology or human nature, it's very difficult to get to the heart of that problem, because we are always changing, and we live in so many different ways. So biologists, anthropologists, ethnologists for decades and decades have tried to get to the heart of these questions and always failed, because it's like jelly. The second you think you've got a grip on it, it just slips through your fingers, because we're always changing. And that's why I think it's so easy for biases and ideologies to get imposed on the questions that we ask and the data that we have and the theories that we then present to people, especially in the absence of evidence, when we don't have very much evidence. For example, when we're talking about the ancient past, we have very little evidence about the ancient past. And so there's so much speculation, and it's heavily loaded with politics, some ideas about supremacy or progress or primitiveness, or lots of different notions about what the past represented and what it means, that are shaped by how we think today in the politics that we're in. And I don't think we'll ever stop doing that, because that's the nature of being human. We grow in a society. We are committed to the societies that we live in. We're committed to the frameworks that are around us. It's very difficult to completely step outside that and imagine what life would be like without any of that. It's impossible. We just can't do it. We are so molded in a certain way to think in certain ways. So I wonder if the only answers then is, one, for science to be as diverse as possible, have as many different ideas, many people from many different backgrounds, in terms of gender and geography and class background, to get a really broad, diverse understanding to these questions. And another thing is that I think scientists need to understand history. One thing you don't get, I don't know what it's like where you live, but certainly in the UK, children specialize quite early in what they want to do. So around the age of 16 or 18, you will decide what you want to study, and you may never study anything else. So, for example, I studied engineering at university. I wrote one essay in that entire 4 years. And even then, I didn't get any training in history or social sciences or anything. I was just expected to write it. And that's not good enough, because all the ideas we have, all the scientific concepts that we have, come from somewhere. And if we don't understand where they come from, we'll just keep replicating them. We'll just keep continuing in the same fashion, even if there are mistakes there. So once we understand the background and the frameworks and the context of our scientific ideas, then I think we're in a position to challenge them.
Yes, definitely. And at the end of the day, everything that we're kind of showing evidence of has to come up with some interpretation of data, right? So everyone has an interpretation. And my question would be, so where should we draw the line between speculation and legitimate interpretation? How can we differentiate between them?
It's really tough. So at the moment, of course, we're in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis. Yes. And what I've seen is lots of speculation based on the patterns that we've seen. We don't have very much data yet, because the pandemic hasn't played out fully. A lot of the patterns of diseases incidents that we've seen, some of it is down to luck. One person gets on a flight, catches it, goes to their particular part of the world and spreads it. So it's not necessarily that that particular part of the world is more susceptible. It's just that that one person happened to, through a chain of events, land in a place that spread it to lots of different people. So I've seen loads of people wondering, for example, are Black people more susceptible to this virus? Are other minorities more susceptible to this virus? Are men more susceptible? Loads of kind of pet theories that people have based on not a huge amount of data, I have to say, not a huge amount of evidence. So, for example, in this country, in the early days of the pandemic, we saw that it was disproportionately affecting people, Black and ethnic minorities, Black and Asian people. People forget that the first place to be heavily hit by COVID in this country was London, where I live. London is minority white. Why would you expect more white cases in a city where the majority of people are not white?
Wow.
Just by demographics, you would expect different patterns from the rest of the population. Now, what we've seen is over time, as the disease has spread across the country, where the demographics are very different, those figures have balanced out. You get fewer rates of incidence between Black and ethnic minority people and more incidence in white people because the demographics in the rest of the country are different. So I think we have to kind of, rather than having these kind of quick hot takes because it's fashionable or because the media demands it or because your research demands it, wait and see. If you don't have evidence and you don't have data, you don't have to offer an opinion. You can just wait and see. And I worry sometimes that scientists are a little too quick to speculate and a little too slow to just wait and see.
What should biology cover and what it shouldn't? And how this affects directly to the studies of race? Where do you think biology has a saying and where do you think it doesn't have a say?
Well, race is not a biological thing. It is a social construct. That's very difficult for people to accept because we see correlations between physical appearance and race. It's never perfect, which is why we so often have to ask someone, where are you from? If it was perfect, we'd never need to ask that question, right? We'd always know just by looking at somebody.
Yeah.
But the reason scientists and social scientists say that race is a social construct is because these categories that we use were always arbitrary. They were always kind of made up based on the limited information that people had about human beings 200-300 years ago. And we still use those categories now. The basic things, black, white, brown, yellow, red, those ideas are hundreds of years old and they have no more basis now than they did then. There is no genetic commonality here. There is no black gene. There is no white gene. You can't actually even reliably 100% tell someone's skin color from testing their DNA.
Yes.
We have so much in common.
Yes, you mentioned, sorry to interrupt, but this was a mind blower when you talked. I can't understand that this actually happened with Hefner. In the first chapter, you mentioned this person who was categorized as white, and he had to fight it in court that he was.
This is how arbitrary these ideas are. So, Caucasian, which is the kind of polite word that we use to describe white people, right, in some societies, Caucasian as defined by this kind of Enlightenment naturalist, Johann Blumenbach, centuries ago, he defined them as everyone from Western Europe to North India. And that meant for a very long time, Egypt, North Africa, was included in that Caucasian category. In fact, I'm included in that Caucasian category. I'm clearly not white, but I would be included in that Caucasian category. And this means that in the US, which uses that Caucasian definition for whiteness, that Egyptian immigrants to the US are automatically categorized as white.
Wow.
Well, they're not all white. Egyptians come in many different shades and colors.
Yes.
And there are some Egyptians which to American eyes, US eyes, look black. And yet they are officially categorized as white. That just goes to show the kind of arbitrariness of this. You can be categorized as black in one country, white in another country, colored in another country, mixed race in another country. It's all really just political and social expediency. Whatever categories have social value in the place that you're in, those are the ones that are used in the place that you're in. There's no kind of biological sense to any of this.
When I apply for a job, for example, or when I need to fill out some medical form or anything, they ask what race I am. So how should I navigate that question now that race is evidently a part of life?
It's tough. I mean, there's two layers to this. One is that obviously these racial categories, these socially defined racial categories, have incredible power in the real world, in the societies that we live in. They define how we are treated by other people. They define sometimes your life expectancy. If you're a Black American, the chances are your life expectancy will be lower. Yeah. So we need this data in order to map how discrimination and racism play out, which is why so many countries collect this data, why it matters to so many places. At the same time, what we have to be careful of is not conflating those kind of social census categories with anything biological. We are, as a species, remarkably homogeneous. We're more homogeneous than chimpanzees, even. We're more homogeneous than most species. And that kind of universal basic humanity we have to keep in mind even when we're ticking these census forms. The other issue is, of course, that it's getting harder and harder to find the right box for everyone. It's easier for me because my parents are both from one region of the world and their ancestors go back there a long way, so it's easy for me to define where I'm from. But if you're mixed race or mixed heritage, it becomes more difficult. And then you can have many generations of mixed heritage people, and then what do you tick after that? What are you supposed to do? In the UK, we have this kind of mixed race category, which conceivably in the future will be the majority of people. Everybody will be mixed heritage of some sort and have to tick that box. And then what meaning does it have? It loses all meaning. It doesn't tell you anything anymore. So, and I don't mean biological meaning, because none of these have biological meaning in the first place, but even social meaning. It loses social meaning at that point, because you could be mixed race in a million different ways. There's no one way of being mixed race. So I think this is something we'll have to kind of grapple with as we move forward. The issue is we can't do away with the categories completely, because if we do that, then we become blind to the way that racism works in society. We have to be able to identify the schisms and how inequality plays, which is why we collect this data. At the same time, the data itself is becoming less and less useful because we are so mixed.
That's my biggest concern, right? So on one hand, we have to study these things because clearly racism is an issue. And on the other, once we do it, it tends to give power to those who are on the extremes. It is evident that people in the United States, more specifically Black people, tend to be killed by police more than white. It's evidence. And if we hypothetically stop filling the blank, what race was him or her, then
we'll never know.
Yes, then it is equivalent to saying, well, he's just a person, and that's a loophole where people who are legitimate racists would say, well, it can happen to all of us because we're people. So it's
it's really tough, and this is something I struggle with as well, because identity politics has become quite a toxic phrase. But at the root of identity politics is this idea that certain groups of people, as socially defined, have been disadvantaged in society, and in order to restore their advantage and put them on an even playing field with everybody else, we have to recognize them, we have to empower them, we have to sometimes celebrate them if they've been deemed inferior over many generations, and we have to celebrate them as well, which is something that you see particularly in the United States in kind of Black empowerment narratives. And we need that. we can't ignore the need for that, because when you've had many centuries of narratives about white supremacy and white superiority,
Yes.
then you need to restore that somehow. The question is, how do you balance that with the equally important narrative for me of universal humanity, that we are all the same underneath? These are not easy things to live side by side, but I think maybe we live in an age, particularly with social media. This is one of the reasons I left social media, actually, is that we demand simple binary narratives for everything. We demand that everything be simple, one or another. And actually, life doesn't work that way. We need a little bit of everything. We need to be able to maintain in our heads the importance of identity politics at the same time as the limitations of identity politics. And that is fine. That is how life works. For example, another thing is we need to maintain this idea that, yes, there is such a thing as human variation, but that doesn't mean that race is real. These also feel like contradictory things, but they're not. It's perfectly possible for those two things to be true. And I think that nuance is missing in the modern news cycle or the social media cycle because of our desperate need for kind of sound bites and simple phrases and basic things. And I hope that we move beyond that and accept that actually everything is a little bit more complicated than that.
Thank you for saying that. And how do we start paving the road towards that future where we can where we can put limits on things and enhance other things and empower certain people and try to remove power to people who actually their intentions are creating more harm? The solutions I try to or I see feasible is talking about things, freedom of expression, sharing things, and these kinds of platforms where I can converse with you for an extended time without trying to catch the perfect thing. It's important, but at the same time, things and conflicting viewpoints will have to be talked with one another, right? So my question here is, should we understand that there are racists in the world. That's a fact. And should we stop talking about issues that will empower these people?
Again, it's very tricky because I think on the far right, on the extreme right, people have used freedom of speech, abused freedom of speech as a means to gain outsized platforms for themselves, disproportionate platforms for themselves. And this is one of the reasons, one of the very many reasons that populism and xenophobia have spread so quickly around the world. They've been so clever at claiming that narrative, at claiming the territory of free speech. Now, I'm not denying them their right to their free speech if they want it. Different countries have different ways of dealing with it. In the US, free speech is absolute. In the UK, where I live, we have hate speech laws, which means that if you incite racial or religious or sexual hatred, there are laws to prevent you from doing that, and you can be prosecuted. It's difficult because I firmly am one of those people who believe we have to listen to everybody, we have to talk to everybody. And in fact, in my last two books, in Inferior and Superior, this is what I did. I interviewed some people who are scientific racists, who hold very different political views from me and very different political views from other people that I've interviewed, on the other ends of the spectrum. And I think what I've come to in my own life, and I don't know if this will work for everybody, but it works for me, is empathy. If you can understand that bias is not something that only exists in other people, but also exists in yourself, then you can start to empathize with people who may hold very different views from you. I don't think anyone is born hating other people. I don't think xenophobia is kind of innate in babies, for instance. I think we learn these things because of the societies that we're in. We may, I don't know, be predisposed to group people or categorize. I don't know. That may or may not be true. We just don't have the evidence to prove either way. But what I do know is that everybody comes to where they come to in their lives through a process of experiences and ideas that they've been fed. I have my own ideas that I've been raised with. I grew up in a very egalitarian family. That is one of the reasons I have the perspective on the world that I do, because I've seen what it's like to live in a family in which everybody does everything. There is no division of the sexes. There is no, that, you know, there may be prejudices, but certainly not as many prejudices as I see out in the wider world. And that has led me to where I am.
Mm-hmm.
There are other things that lead people to where they are. And I've tried very hard in my work to understand that. How did they get to where they are? So personally, I feel like, although it's important to catalogue and recognise racism in society, discrimination, to see where groups or individuals are being persecuted unfairly, we need to protect them. We always need to protect the most vulnerable in society. I think what we also need to do is recognise that bias is not, and racism is not, something that only exists in other people. It's not just those people over there. It is something we are all raised with.
Yes.
It is something, to live in society is to be exposed to racism, or at least racist ideas, from a very young age. And if we can recognize our own biases, then maybe we'll do a better job of moving beyond this kind of culture of hatred that we have at the moment.
Yes, there's this proverb that says that to be free of ignorance, you must recognize it first. And I think that's, I agree with you.
It's not easy.
It isn't, and it's often hurtful, to say, I'm usually seeing this the way that's the whole purpose of this podcast, try to keep the most open mind as possible. And you put it perfectly. Everyone comes from a certain place. No one here, that's one of my biggest life philosophies. No one was born with a recipe of how to deal with existence and being conscious, and this is a good take from this interview, because I didn't know that we had so much plasticity in us, and that's amazing. It means that we're here as we are shaped by our experiences. We're here to live those experiences, and people are created through those, and that's amazing. I need to ask you, what is truth? Because truth in the World War II was, there's only one race that needed to survive. Truth right now is we need progress.
I hate to say it, because the scientist's answer would be that we can achieve objective truth about everything, that one day we will be able to explain pretty much everything. And I do subscribe to that ideal, but I think in real life, on an everyday level, in the way that society plays out, truth is really in the eye of the beholder. Sometimes this is really about where you stand, ultimately, what truth you're choosing to accept, what facts you're choosing to live by, what you're choosing to reject, and how you're choosing to live your life. And the truth is that however much science is an endeavor that aims to get to the truth, in practice, we have to understand that politics and society and culture don't operate always on the basis of evidence and fact. And we need a better understanding of that as well. Maybe it's a psychological question, maybe it's a philosophical question. For me personally, and this is where I landed when I was writing Superior, I think it's more about a question of narratives. What narratives do we paint about who we are and who we want to be? And if you paint, for example, a very nationalist narrative about exceptionalism or about supremacy or superiority of one group over another, then you will very quickly find that the evidence will start to serve that narrative. Whoever has that evidence. We saw this happen in Nazi Germany. We've seen it happen so many different times in various countries in the world. So I think we need to ask ourselves fundamentally, not just about valuing evidence and facts, which is important, but also about creating narratives that are inclusive, that value all human life, and that recognize our universal humanity.
Yes, and that was another question that I had, is that we often think that evidence moves narratives, but it is clear that narratives have moved the evidence to fit that particular idea. And that's
they always have. From the very birth of modern science, from Enlightenment science onwards, you will see that theories, categories, our racial categories, everything was serving particular narratives, political narratives at that particular point in time. And it is still doing that. Mm-hmm. We don't always see it because we're inside this world now, we're inside this time. Mm-hmm. So we're occupying that narrative, and we don't have the benefit of hindsight, mm-hmm. but we will see it in the future. And I think what we need, like I said, is to build better narratives.
Could we truly separate politics from science? Is it possible?
No, I don't think it's possible. I think science is inherently political, and that goes all the way from funding. So who gets to study the sciences, who is funded to look at certain questions, what is the science there for? I mean, this is becoming a bigger and bigger question as funding becomes limited, is do we want science for the sake of truth, or do we want science that serves political agendas and people? And, at the moment we're racing towards a vaccine. All this effort is going towards this vaccine.
Yes.
That is about funding. That is about priorities. So I think science is always political at every single stage.
Wow. I understand it. It's hard to to come to terms with, because it is funny, that me personally and other people have regarded scientists as people who don't have any prejudice, any biases, any interest from themselves, right? So they're the good guys in the fight, when actually they're also people, and people, tend to have their own viewpoints, tend to have their own lens of how they see the world, and that's
it's they're just human.
Yes, exactly. They're just human. It's difficult to accept.
And that's not a bad thing, because it's humans that came up with empiricism and the methods and the tools and all these wonderful things that we have in order to explore the world that we do. It's not a bad thing that we have bias or prejudice or anything, if that's part of what it means to be human. But we can't pretend then to be objective all the time if we're not, because then that only skews reality.
Exactly.
Because it doesn't give us a clearer picture.
Yes, one thing that just talking out loud is a good idea for us to just trying to, and for me to just seeing scientists as people who don't have prejudices, is just, what if they disclose their funding? What if they disclose their interests? Or because they sometimes they don't, or most times they don't. I think when I see research, it's not saying that I'm doing research that says tobacco is good for you, and I'm not disclosing that I'm funded by, tobacco company. we don't see that.
I mean, they really should. There is. I've written articles for academic journals, and there's always a form that they give you to disclose your whatever financial interests you have. So you should really disclose it. But of course, we know that not everybody does. We know that there are other, not just personal interests, but sometimes political interests, or things that you may not necessarily want to disclose or need to disclose, operating behind the agenda. And I think prejudice is one of those interests.
Yes.
It's one of those things we don't declare, but we all have.
I mean, it's tricky, right? When I imagine myself, feeling the lines that says what are your prejudices, and put it that way, and I would feel bad just accepting them and saying that doesn't put me in the best position to land the job, for example. But it's something we have to explore, and honestly, if we do want to help improve everyone's life, not just someone's life, it's gonna take a good hard look in the mirror and say, here's the deal. And but collectively, because what if I disclose my information, then no one else does?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of problems with science at the moment in terms of hierarchies and promotion, and how it's structured in a way to serve sometimes people at the top rather than in a kind of more democratic way, everybody in the system.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of egos there. There are a lot of vested interests in this business. It is a business. We have to remember that science is also a business. And when you understand it that way, when you frame it that way, which is, my job as a science journalist, my job is not just to kind of explain the science to people. It's also to go behind the business of science and explain the kind of messy workings in the background, which I think don't undermine science. All they do is illuminate it and help us understand actually why scientists sometimes get things wrong.
Exactly. I want to see more research papers that said, we couldn't confirm our hypothesis, nor we couldn't reject it. We're open for collaboration. We're open for someone to have their take in, but usually journals don't publish papers that don't have a conclusive answer, right? Well, we've covered a lot of topics regarding pretty much everything that surrounds the book Superior. I think everything here is relevant to the book. And how do you see the future of genetics, of everything unfolding?
There is one scenario playing out right now that I think for me highlights how the last century has been a little bit too focused on genes and not enough focused on everything else, not just biological systems, but other systems. There are many systems that contribute to who we are. So, for example, I've noticed very many geneticists and very many researchers who want to look at genetic data to understand why some people get COVID and not others. But who do we see the biggest differences between in terms of susceptibility, death, and illness? It is not between racial groups. It's not even among gender. It's between age. It's young people and old people. Now, as far as I'm aware, your genes do not change between you being young and you being old. So what value is there then in putting so much effort into looking at genetic differences when it's an age difference that we're looking at here? There must be something else going on if it's an age differential that really determines the rates of death. And I think this kind of heavy focus on genetics all the time, as though genetics can explain everything. We really have to move away from that and look for other aspects of our biology to understand who we are.
It's very important to understand that there is not a black or white scenario. There's usually gray areas, and usually right now the world is very complex, and we've seen it in a macro scale with the pandemic. Everyone is in their house. So we can't say that, there's an isolated region. Everyone is affected by things. And if we wanted to connect the world in a globalized way, we need to acknowledge that all of the things have to be connected as well. So there's not so many isolated things. I really appreciate you taking the time. And is there anything else you want to share us with the audience, with our listeners? With me?
Well, I do hope people read Superior and try and absorb it. I'm often asked, what is the one argument you have to kind of demolish race or demolish this, or, to convince people? The fact is there's no simple argument here. It's a very slow process of understanding and reading and really getting to the heart of it. And if I could have made Superior any shorter, I would have. But I couldn't. No. This is how much you need in order to get to where you need to be.
Yes, definitely. And for me, it was, an eye-opener, honestly. It showed me that this is an issue that has too many angles, too many perspectives, and I admire that you interviewed so many people with so many perspectives that sometimes conflicted with yours, and you honestly said it in the book, which is I admire it. And I thought that I mentioned it throughout the interview. It's been amazing to get this new perspective, and I thank you for it. I thank you for writing this book.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on your podcast. And good luck as you cope with this crisis, as we're coping with the crisis.
Yeah, likewise. I'll stay in touch, and thank you so much. Take care.
You're very welcome. Take care. Bye then.
Thanks for tuning in for this edition of Through Conversations podcast. If you find this episode interesting, don't miss out on new conversations, and subscribe to the podcast at any podcast feed you use, and leave me a review. Also, consider sharing it with someone you think can enjoy this episode. Our new awesome music is by Joe Lyle. More info can be found at joelyledrums.com. Hosted and produced by Alex Levy.